Shabbat Shalom. I'm honored to share this traditional rite of Jewish passage with you all. That's right, Mom, Dad, today I am a doctor. Not that kind of doctor, to be honest. I'm the kind of doctor that would be handy, for example, if you're on an airplane and you hear the pilot say, "Excuse me, folks, but there's a passenger who's having a bibliographic emergency. Does anyone on this plane know a lot about books?" I'd be there in a flash. That's the topic of my dissertation, by the way, books. The official title is Making Jewish Books in North Africa, 1700 to 1900. Real page turner, so to speak. I've spent 5 years of my life becoming someone who knows a lot about books. I want to tell you first about someone else who knew a lot about books. In my childhood, when my grandmother would find me with my nose in a book, which was, in fact, usually how she found me, she would laugh and say, "It figures, you know, in our family, we have ink in our veins and not blood." She was thinking of her father, Samuel or Shmuel Polisky, born in 1880 in the small city of Mogilev, today in eastern Belarus. My great-grandfather, Sam, loved books, and especially Jewish books. My grandmother remembers sitting at the table as a child after dinner and hearing him read the great works of Yiddish literature aloud to her mother, my great-grandmother Gittel or Katie Blumenthal, who would wash the dishes to the sounds of Sholom Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz, and Mendele Moicher Sforim. Sam was a founding member of the local Yiddish school and a subscriber to the Canadian Yiddish journal, Der Kenner der Edler. Sam and Katie were also active members of the Yiddish Literary and Dramatic Society of Ottawa. But my great-grandfather was not himself a figure of Yiddish literary or dramatic history. He was not himself an author, journalist, playwright, or a poet. And the ink that flowed from his veins to my grandmother and from her to my father and then to me was not the ink of a writer or an artist, but a printer. And more specifically, he was a pressman. Now, what does a pressman do? By the late 19th century, the art of printing had become far more industrialized than the hand-cranked presses of the early modern period, but my great-grandfather's profession still demanded a high degree of technical skill as well as physical labor. The American printer William Kelly, in his 1902 book, Presswork, a practical handbook for the use of pressmen, includes among the duties of the turn-of-the-century pressman the following: cleaning the press, arranging the tympans, preparing the underlays, layers of paper or cardboard to ensure a standard and uniform surface, packing the cylinder to roll smoothly over the bed, preparing overlays to create gradations of light and color for illustrations, mixing the inks to the correct consistency and color, clearing the paper of static electricity and wetting it appropriately, running the first impression through to be checked before printing, feeding the paper in and gathering the sheets, washing off the rollers after the printing, troubleshooting any mechanical issues with the printing process, as well as navigating the vagaries of cold, hot, or damp weather, and dealing with any unusual requirements such as deckled paper, gold leaf, or vignetted illustrations. In other words, the pressman was responsible for all the specialized mechanics of the technology of making books. Upon arriving at work, my great-grandfather repeated this whole process, hundreds of times a day, 5 or 6 days a week, for 43 years, until his death. At the turn of the 20th century, a flatbed press could turn out 7,000 pages a day. So in his 4 decades of work as a pressman, my great-grandfather must have participated in the making of tens of thousands, maybe millions of books. And yet, not a single one of those books bears his name. As neither author nor publisher, he is nowhere to be found on any title page or any page of the books he made with his own hands. A few years ago, I stood in the vault of the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, where my grandmother donated her father's Yiddish books decades ago. Surrounded by over 1,000,000 Yiddish books, I wondered if any of them were my great-grandfather's. Perhaps one of the books that he held, and perhaps even a book that he shaped, was right there on the shelf in front of me. It is this unrecognized labor which I hope to have honored in my dissertation. Not only the work of the people who wrote books, but the work of the people who made books, who scribed and decorated them, who edited and printed and bound them, along with the people who bought and sold them, and of course, the people who read them. Sam Polisky did not have a fancy PhD in book history. He never even went to college. But there is no question in my mind that he knew quite a lot about books. And in many ways, he knew more about them than me. He knew about books not only in theory, but also in practice. He knew about books with his body. He made them. He lived them. This brings me to a striking metaphor in this week's Haftarah, which, since the Parshat are joined, is the Haftarah for Bechukotai. In castigating the people for their sins, the prophet Jeremiah declares that their guilt, quote, is inscribed with a pen of iron, engraved with a thorny point on the tablet of their hearts. Ktuva be'et barzel, betziporen shamir, charusha al luach libam. In other words, the text of our covenant with God is not just inscribed on stone tablets or scrolls of parchment or reams of paper, but in our own bodies. We ourselves are a kind of book. Later on in Jeremiah, he returns to this language, emphasizing that when the people do repent, God declares, quote, I will put my covenant inside them, and I will write it on their hearts, al libam echtavena, and all of them, from the least of them to the greatest, shall know me. Our lives, our actions, and our choices, individually and communally, are all part of the ongoing process of writing and reading our book. This is something that I found to be true in my dissertation. A book is more than a concrete material object, but a social one as well. Books have ongoing life cycles, extending both before and after the one moment of their creation. They emerge through and live within the social networks of community. The rabbis of the Talmud also believed that it wasn't enough for texts to stay on the page. The material, the social, and the bodily aspects of the book had to be considered together. Again and again, the Talmud compares the bodies of its rabbis and scholars to the books or scrolls of the Torah, declaring that witnessing the death of a sage is like seeing a Torah scroll in flames. Even a fetus in its mother's womb, according to the Talmud, is like a pinkas shemekupal, a folded up notebook. In the tractate of Eruvin, we hear the story of the famed sage Bruria, who, quote, came across a certain student who was reading in silence. She kicked him and said to him, quoting from the book of Shmuel Bet, isn't it written, Arucha ushmura, in all things arranged and secure? Meaning, she explained, Im arucha b'ramach evarim shalcha mishtameret. If the Torah is arranged in each of the 248 bones of your body, it will be secure. And if not, it will not. In fact, elsewhere in the Talmud, the rabbis determine, perhaps with the help of my kind of a doctor, that the human body has exactly 248 bones and 365 tendons, which add up to the 613 mitzvot of the Torah. And in the Jewish mystical tradition, this is expanded into numerous teachings that elaborate on which commandment corresponds to which part of the body, and precisely how our performance of mitzvot and study of Torah in this world affects the supernal divine world of the Torah in heaven. As the scholar of Kabbalah Elliot Wolfson summarizes, quote, the body of one who observes the commandments is transformed into a body composed of the very same letters of those commandments. In other words, we are walking books. Even God's body, Kivyachol, if we can imagine such a thing at all, is imagined as a book. In a passage in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, the rabbis pull apart one of the verses describing the body of the beloved, who in the rabbinic imagination is assumed to be God. So Shir HaShirim says, Rosho ketem paz, kvutzotav taltalim shchorot ka'orev. His head is of the finest gold, his hair forms wavy curls, black as a raven. And the Midrash explains, his head, this is the Torah, The finest gold, these are the words of the Torah. Wavy curls, these are the lines on the parchment. And black as a raven, these are the letters. God's body is the Torah scroll itself. And the Torah scroll itself, with its lined parchment and inked letters, is God's body. Another Midrashic compilation called Aseret HaDibrot similarly asserts that since the Torah existed before the creation of the world, the first Torah must have been written on God's own body. I quote, "Before the world was created, skins for parchment did not exist for the Torah to be written upon, since there were still no animals. So on what was the first Torah written? On the arm of the Holy Blessed One, with black fire on white fire." Even the primordial origins of our universe are to be found in the making of a book. And we too, in the image of God, likewise, have books encoded into each part of our body. So what does it mean to make books with our bodies and to live with books in our bodies? I argue that it expands our vision of where Judaism can be found. Too often we allow our status as people of the book, a phrase, I must point out, comes from the Quran's classification of monotheistic non-Muslims and was originally neither a specific description of Jews nor a Jewish self-conception. But the idea of the people of the book narrows our vision of Judaism to a collection of books. And too often we conflate the history of those books with the history of the people whose names are on the cover. The standard textbooks and timelines of Jewish history are filled with great authors and writers, Maimonides, Spinoza, Theodor Herzl, and Albert Einstein. And we can throw in a few women in there too for equality's sake. Let's say Glickl of Hamelin and Anne Frank. But a history of Judaism written only on the basis of the names on the title pages of Jewish books is a history that is sorely lacking and deeply flawed. This dethroning of the book might seem like an odd position, and perhaps even a heretical one, for someone with a fresh PhD in Jewish book history. When I began researching my dissertation, I myself imagined that much of it would focus on the famous rabbis and learned scholars whose books are found in libraries around the world. But as I entered the world of the archive, I found myself much more drawn to the stories of the people whose names are not found on the title page, but whose lives and bodies were intertwined with the repetitive processes of bookmaking, scribing line after line, sorting metal letter punches into trays, rubbing ink over press forms, and sewing bundles of pages together. I'm interested in the anonymous scribes who copied hundreds of manuscripts page by candlelight, and in the readers who left doodles of teapots and grazing sheep in their margins. I'm interested in the Ashkenazi pressmen working in an 18th century Dutch printing house, of whom I found traces in an Algerian manuscript still marked with their Yiddish pencil notes to each other. "I must start this page again. This heading should be set in bold," with their inky fingerprints around the edges. And I'm interested in a woman named Nuna, the widow of a certain Yehuda Adib, living in Debdu, a small town in eastern Morocco near the Algerian border at the end of the 19th century. In the winter of 1879, she dedicated 30 gold piasters, a not inconsiderable sum of money, in order to purchase a set of the Babylonian Talmud for the use of her family. What other books did she own? Did she herself know how to read? And if so, did she study Talmud? Or was her love for the Jewish tradition so expansive that despite her own inability to make sense of the cramped text on the pages, she knew nonetheless that these books held power, connection to a past, and wisdom for the future? Unfortunately, I cannot say. Today, we might have established the Nuna Adib Memorial Library in her honor, but at the time, it seems that the only recognition she got, which is in fact the only record I have found of any element of her life at all, is a single legal notice drawn up on a slip of paper, not much larger than a credit card, recording the circumstances of her donation. Someone happened to save this scrap of paper and passed it on to their children, and someone else sold it to a collector who sold it to an archive where a librarian cataloged it so that I could locate it for my research. In other words, it is one story that happened to have survived, where so many others could have and, in fact, have vanished. The archive demonstrates, by its insufficiencies and its fragments, by its silences and gaps, by its very nature, how much is missing from it. The material bodies of the books that I studied taunts me with their silence. If only they could talk. If only they could describe the many hands they passed through, to whom I am now connected by my own contact with the book. As Natalie Zeman Davis, one of the foremost historians of the early modern period, describes her own archival work, she writes, quote, "I still recall the look of the archival sources I've used, the large, heavy volumes with their leather thongs and original bindings, the bundles of paper tied with string, sometimes with a centuries-old pin holding pages together. In their handwriting, their occasional doodles and asides, I have in my hands a link to persons long dead. It strengthens my historian's commitment to tell of the past with as much discernment, insight, and honesty as I can." It is this sense of responsibility to these whispered nuances of the past that I have tried to develop in my dissertation, and which I believe are embodied, unintended, in the slippery metaphors that connect us, our books, our bodies, our tradition, and our God. My friend and colleague, Mara Benjamin, in her most recent book on the spiritual and philosophical weight of motherhood, has outlined how our narrow historical focus on the book only as a textual object has blinded us to the truth of how Torah lives in us, in our lives, and in our relationships. As she writes, and I quote, "The primal heart of Torah and mitzvot can only be truly known through the relationships of care and obligation we experience daily. The fully realized meaning of Torah is grasped and transmitted in the quotidian work of caring for young children, and the Talmid Chacham, the learned scholar, who is one who disciplines the mind, heart, and body to engage in this work." End quote. I think this reoriented, expanded understanding of embodied Torah, of how the book is known and transmitted through labor and relationship, can be applied to any number of bodily activities, from cooking to crafting and even bookmaking itself. In that sense, then, my newly minted PhD testifies that I have mastered at least this first step in knowing the book. But living the book, I still have a long way to go. Shabbat Shalom.